I'm here to introduce Jake, but first I'll introduce myself. I'm Rebecca Rising, the Riparian Restoration Manager at Skagit Fisheries Enhancement Group. Your next speaker is Jake Sullivan. He is a forester with the Swinomish Indian Tribal Community. And in his work, he created a forest management plan using variable density thinning as the main type of commercial harvest on tribal trust lands. His prior work as a silviculture forester in the private industry exposed him to a variety of forest management techniques to meet certification standards and habitat conservation plans for timberlands in Washington and Oregon. Go ahead, Jake.
Look at this. What is this? Is this a shade sanctuary, a successful Douglas fir plantation, a forested desert? To me, this is all of those things. If your restoration site looks like this, is it providing the function you intended? Like, how healthy are the trees that you planted once they've reached this age? Because it's a long road before those trees look like this tree. Variable density thinning, it's a management technique that can reduce resource strain, promote structural complexity, and increase species diversity within a forest stand. I'm talking about this because some restoration sites are approaching the age where a thinning could benefit the trees and reduce the burden on the site resources. This is very dependent on the goals for the site. Forest stands have a stocking maximum. When this is reached, trees begin to die. This is natural. It's called self-thinning. But it also predisposes them to stress and reduce their capacity to survive drought, insect and disease outbreak, and can lead to increased wildfire risk and intensity. Generally, by removing a portion of the wood volume and preempting natural mortality, thinning alters the competitive environment of the stand and redistributes access to site resources, light, nutrients, and water among the residual trees. Again, what are the future goals of the site? I'm assuming many here are managing streamside restoration sites where shade is one of the main objectives. If your plantation is only 30 feet wide, it can handle a very high density. But maybe you're managing a much larger area, and perhaps outside of this riparian buffer, thinning should be considered. Here's a resource from OSU that uses average diameter and stocking, give you a relative density. Note, this is for even age stands. Using average diameter is not a traditional metric for relative density. Usually they use what's called quadratic mean diameter, which gives bigger trees a higher weight. But if you planted it all at the same time, all the conifers, you can expect they're an even age class, and the diameters will be somewhat close to each other. Note too, like they kind of use some scare tactics here. Danger and zone of no return. Sites in these scenarios, from an industrial perspective, are too late to thin based on like recapturing the volume and increased growth. But if you're considering like the ecological function and drought resilience of the site, I think a thinning is still a good treatment, no matter what the density is. Just a tidbit like about Washington DNR forest practices for riparian buffers. The desired future condition is to have, a very dense stand. What they're looking for is a basal area of 320 square feet per acre. And if you had 50 trees per acre that are 36 inches, you would reach that basal area target, but you'd also be at what they call the zone of no return. So again, take these terms lightly. I think in many scenarios for restoration purposes, the thinning is a great treatment to release the trees and give them a better chance of surviving drought or other environmental issues. Like these tables are used a lot in industrial forests where they basically try and keep trees in what's called the Goldilocks zone. So once your stand gets into the danger zone, you'll thin it back to lower Goldilocks and repeat and repeat. That way you're capturing the best growth and extracting products. Very site specific though, because logging costs. Other things, access. In general, though, thinning will release the trees from competition, and it can achieve habitat and growth goals on a shorter time scale. Variable density thinning specifically can help achieve a few other goals without natural disturbance. If you want to get some structural complexity, variable density thinning kind of gives you the options there. And then any thinning is going to help understory development. If light's not reaching the floor, you're probably not going to have much of an understory. And then in variable density thinning, where there's patch cuts, that's where you have the opportunity to change the species distribution with artificial regeneration and openings, and where you're thinning, selecting the species if you have a mixed stand. The other thing about variable density thinning is like, is this a commercial operation? Are your trees of commercial size, and based on access, can you create some revenue to pay for the treatment? Variable density thinning is usually the logging costs reduced versus just standard matrix thinning. To ensure continued productivity in a forest stand in the future, thinning should be applied early. It's good to think about the site characteristics here. Is it in a buffer? Pre-commercial thinning, which is done by chainsaw, where you leave the items on the ground, can be done in riparian buffer. Commercial harvest is not generally. You have to leave the trees on site, and the bigger the tree, the more expensive it is to fall them. Pre-commercial thinning does have a cost. And this is done at the age, like let's say 12 to 20, depending on site characteristics for conifer trees. I think a realistic cost commercially is $200 to $500 per acre. Could be more. Maybe you're dealing with a particularly nasty stand or difficult terrain, or maybe the road to the site was decommissioned, 3 miles back, so someone's gonna have to hike in to get there. Or maybe you have a free labor source, like a conservation crew or some other. Thinking about if these are at a commercial level too, you got to extract the logs out of the site to pay for that if that's what you're planning to do. So is the timber value high enough to pay for the cost of the treatment? Variable density thinning kind of has 3 main buckets. There's patch cuts, where you're removing all or most of the trees or vegetation, and then there's the leave areas where you're not thinning or lightly thinning, and then the thinning matrix where you're kind of targeting a specific trees per acre or relative density or basal area. But that's just 3. You could have 20 treatments, depending on the complexity and management goals and the resources that you have to get them done. So patch cuts, or gaps, as we call them. The size really needs to fit the goal. Maybe you're planning to want to get some shade tolerant species. Well, you don't have to make it that big, but if you have shade intolerant species you want to plant in there, it has to be big enough for them to get sun. Other things to consider, depending on where you're operating with forest practice rules, like if you remove 50% of the timber within 5 years, it's going to require a reforestation plan if it gets up below 100 trees per acre. So normally, I think in most variable density thinnings, any patch is planned to be reforested. It's a way to like amend species distribution. But if maybe you're trying to do just a seed tree setup, you have to leave about 8 acres or 8 trees per acre per DNR rules, Washington Forest Practices, in patch cuts. Leave areas or skips, and this is where you don't thin. This is where you leave the site dense, denser than those density measurement diagrams. Like think of these as like thickets, which they do provide like a ecological function. So wildlife refuge, shade, also areas where soil erosion is a concern. So here in these riparian management zones where you plant it up against the stream bank, leaving those thick is a good idea. Matrix thinning, this is where you're actually cutting some and leaving some. You might have a target trees per acre or relative density or basal area, depending on what your long-term goals. Are you planning to come back and harvest commercially, or is this a one and done? Those stand density tables will help you plan for a future harvest. And then just like a standard practice in industrial forestry over here in Western Washington is to plant at 10 by 10 or 11 by 11, so 435 to 350 trees per acre, and PCT down to 250, 275 when they're 14 to 20. This allows for future harvests. There will still be lots of trees in good form and ability to extract more in the future. Leaving them be isn't the end of the world. This natural succession is a thing. The stand will fall apart and new stuff will grow up under it. I think the downside of having stuff really dense is there will be a long period of low productivity and increased stress. Thinning early on is fairly straightforward before they're of commercial side. Pre-commercial thinning is done by people yielding chainsaws. It's not super expensive. It can be actually kind of fun when you're out there doing it, depending on the site, because you're like envisioning the future forest. You get to see the spacing you're setting. Overall, it's just there to help your stand thrive. More resources available for the trees to grow faster. There are some, initial changes. So some negative responses. You can reduce in height and diameter growth, chlorotic foliage, and damage or mortality associated with increased exposure, like sun scald. These negative responses are usually called thinning shock, and it's attributed to immediate changes in the microclimate of the stand. But in the long term, most of these show benefit from the stand. But I do want to point out, in pre-commercial thinning, like you see in this photo, directly after there is a spike in wildfire risk. Until that material breaks down. I have anecdotal observation from the 2020 Labor Day fires in Oregon. Things that were pre-commercially thinned in the recent past were completely lost. This is no research. Fire is dynamic, and there's a lot of variables that can increase or decrease intensity, but dead down debris like this is basically kindling. So there's just kind of this spike after something like this happens where someone were to flick a cigarette butt into those woods. I'm pretty sure it's not going to end well. I think the takeaway for thinning, especially like in sites, is look up. I think the easiest way to see if your forest is healthy and thriving is crown percent. If it's under 30% of the total height of the tree, it's starting to dwindle, and the crown is the factory. This is where the tree produces everything and is a great way to assess the health. And then the other, like with your site, can people access it with chainsaws? Is this even feasible? Are the species you planted long-lived? Maybe you have some short-lived species and you realize maybe this site isn't going to be harvested. So you want to interplant. So maybe you need to make some patch cuts and put in some species that are going to be there for the long haul, or you're seeing a mortality event based on current changes in stress or pests. And then are these marketable products? So is your restoration site now 30 years old? There may be a way to pay the treatment if you do have marketable products to extract. This is a commercial variable density thin that I am promoting here. So just the basics of it in the matrix, which is the blue, that's where we're thinning 35% of the timber volume. So that's the matrix. The leave area, which has the cross hatching and the red outline, that's where we're not going. We're going to leave it. And this stand is just about 380 to 400 trees per acre. And then the patch cuts, which are the purple circles, that's where we'll be removing all of the trees besides our leaf tree requirement and planting a new forest. So we're creating basically three structures within this stand, which is a monoculture Douglas fir plantation from 40 years ago. And I want to like bring this site up. This is actually Hanson Creek, which the SRSC, Skagit River System Cooperative, has been replanting. Just these are some considerations about thinning too. So I'm not a hydrologist or a plant physiologist. but I think we should consider the effects a forest can have on stream flows, especially on a larger scale. I'm not trying to discount the benefits of, nutrient cycling, runoff reduction, infiltration, shade, and microclimate creation. But that's the reason these areas are being restored, right? But also a dense regenerating forest, it uses more water for transpiration than just a field. There's a scale component to this, obviously. Like I said, if the strip of buffer, it can be very dense and still be providing all the things you want, native plants, shade. But on a larger scale, I think it's worth bringing up for discussion. At some point, these areas that were planted 10 by 10, 11 should be thinned. Maybe the stand is providing a ton of shade, but it's also lowering in-stream flows, and you could have a very unhealthy forest that's starting to fall apart. Thinning can amend this. You can still get all the other benefits, the shade, erosion, nutrient cycling, and then allow the trees a little bit of space to grow and fight off insect and disease, drought, and have a better forest in the end. I bring this up since from the Northwest Natural Resource Group climate adaptation strategies white paper. It's just a cool table that gives you drought tolerance, shade tolerance, and average age max. None of these are set in stone. There's Douglas fir that are very, very old, and Grenfir as well. But I think this is a good thing to consider when you're planting a site and selecting species. That's pretty much it. Open for questions now here, but I just wanted to share that OSU. It's just kind of a nifty table for stand density. So if you wanted to go out and see if maybe your stands are approaching the zone of no return, and based on trees per acre and average diameter, it gives you a relative density. But again, don't be super scared by those. These are all just tools.
Could you speak to FPA requirements within riparian management zones, specifically how to plan for and implement thinning within riparian management zones while meeting FPA requirements?
So anytime you don't take the trees, you don't need an FPA. It's called a type 1 harvest. And I've spoken with some forest practice foresters about it. And a lot of times, maybe you inherited a site that was all logged off that shouldn't have been, because it should have been protected as a buffer, and it was replanted. Either way, killing and leaving trees doesn't require an FPA. Killing and taking trees does. And so there's the way forest practices works in Washington. There's kind of 3 zones. There's the core zone, the inner zone, and the outer zone. The only way you can really amend the inner or the outer zone is if, based on the density, it's going to meet these desired future conditions, or the species composition is such that it's like a lot of hardwoods, and you can do what's called a hardwood conversion. They're really site specific, so it depends on if it's a S or water of the state, fish bearing, not fish seasonal, fish perennial. There's forest practice foresters that will really help you, because there's a lot of ways you could go about it. But in general, if it's a fish bearing stream, that core zone, 50 feet, you can't do anything with. But you certainly could pretty commercially thin it. If you planted 10 by 10 and now you have a 30-year-old stand that's only got 20% crown, I think it would benefit that stand to reduce it some. But yeah, if you're going to commercially harvest, getting an FPA is really site specific on what riparian type of fish stream has fish. Like I said, if it's under 10 feet or greater than 10 feet wide, that changes all the widths. But in general, it's not good to think about commercial harvest there, because it's pretty hard to do, and it's not going to be a lot what is legally able to be extracted.
We have a question about how long does the increase in wildfire risk last?
I don't have any research on that, but anecdotally, I think, in 5 years, on the west side, it's pretty broken down after it's been left on the ground. But within the first 2 years, it is like a tinderbox of just dead foliage. And it depends on how the crew breaks it down. Like if they're limbing the stems that they fall or just leaving them full. The more they cut it up, the faster it will break down and the lower it will be, but the cost will be more for the crew. And then if you had the opportunity to take like a chipper through there and yeah, it would be less time. The more it's broken down, the less time it will be.
Do you think desirable understory plants will migrate into thinned areas, even if the planting site is surrounded by agriculture?
I don't think so. I think you're gonna have to plant what you want. I can't imagine, like a service berry, unless, I guess it's oak if a bird comes by and drops the berries in the openings, then that could work. But I think artificial regeneration will be required to get the species diversity you need.
How do your target densities vary between conifer-dominated riparian forests and broadleaf or shrub-dominated species?
Well, there's kind of like density management diagrams for a lot of commercial species, and red alder, but like for shrub and, like I'm thinking like a willow, or I've never done one of those. Really, I think the focus would be on like conifer and red alder. And there's you can just look them up, but in general, just trying to look at your crowns. You're seeing that you're getting to like a really low crown percentage. You need to cut it down, and then using like those, like that, what I gave you at the OSU, it'll give you relative densities. And I mean, you could turn it really low, but then you could expect that if you let them, because the stability of the stand will decrease as it gets denser and denser once you thin it. So if you let it get to 20% crown and then you thin it way down, it's not going to be very stable, and it's going to be subject to wind throw. It's not like really wind hardy. So there's just a lot to consider, but in general, I think, removing 1/3 to 1/2 of the volume is pretty common.
Okay.
Again, I want to plug, actually, I see there's some more questions about like the buffering. So forest practice foresters are available for each region. I think the one in our region is Hollis Crapo, which I've spoke with before, but if you go on Washington DNR site, they can help you a lot with what you can do with your buffer. Commercial harvest is something we're thinking about.
And do you have opinions on how to select which trees to thin, leaving the oldest and largest, cutting the sick, leaving the young, etc.?
Yeah, I definitely have opinions. I think there's a couple scenarios, right? Like if you have a mixed species stand and you want to redistribute diversity, like maybe there's one species that's kind of doing really well, but you want some of the others to survive, then you can kind of target thinning that. The other is like look for trees that are already winning, or that's how I've always done it. So if it's like a all Douglas fir plantation and there's some trees that are already losing the battle, like they're smaller and they're a little bit shorter, those are the ones I thin. And then I think like if you're worried about a pest, so maybe you have a bunch of spruce that have the tip weevil, and then you would target the spruce and get rid of those because they're maybe not adding to the height growth and you're trying to produce shade. So yeah, lots to consider there.
Do you ever utilize girdling for thinning or incorporate snags into your plan?
Yeah, especially if you're in a scenario where the trees are large, right? And you can't commercially harvest. I think girdling would be a great way to thin it effectively and at the same time create, like a wildlife snag. A lot of times in those dense thickets, in variable density thinning, you'll create some snags to, if you have like a wildlife target, so many snags per acre that you need to achieve in part of your, maybe your habitat conservation plan, if you're operating one of those. So yeah, there's a lot of, I think girdling is a great way with larger trees when you don't want to actually fall them and reduce the stems.
Okay. Have you looked into forest mycorrhizal networks for different thinning techniques?
I haven't. I will say that I've discussed with people like, about thinning shock. Perhaps that's like part of it. Like, it's like all the trees were sharing nutrients and water, and then you're cutting half of them out, and that network gets disturbed, and that could be part. But I don't know of any like research or outcomes from that. But I certainly respect that is something to consider.
Okay, and can you say more about forest practices limitations when doing VDT in riparian areas?
I guess like I will just say that mostly there's a few programs for small landowners and hardwood conversions, and if your site is dense enough to meet these metrics that are the desired future conditions of the area, those all take a desired future condition. To do that, you have to go in and measure every tree and get the diameters and plug it into this forest practice. It's called FPARS, but it wants to, at the age of 140, be this much basal area. So that takes a lot of measuring and some expertise. In general, the core zone, you got to leave it alone from commercial, but you can pre-commercially thin. That's like young stuff, like these plantations that we're talking about. The inner and outer, reach out to the DNR forest practice forester, because your specific site, the ownership, is it an industrial landowner? Do they harvest more than this many board feet per year? It changes the rules that apply to you. So it's not that complicated, but it's best to talk with forest practice foresters. They can lead you down the right path, but in general, you can pre-commercially thin, like the young stuff, just have people go through it. These plantations that you put in for restoration sites, before they reach an age where they're too big, I would say if you have, 400 trees per acre at the age of 20, it's a good idea to go through and thin that.
And at what age and to what density would you recommend thinning a riparian restoration planting?
At 15 to 20, I would say taking it down to 250 is a pretty common practice, and it allows the trees to grow vigorously, and it doesn't open it up so much that you're going to have lots of big skips and gaps where sunlight or unwanted things are going to happen.
Can you elaborate on the use of crown to density ratio for deciding when to thin?
Yeah, so I think in conifers, if your crown is below 30%, so the total height of the tree has less than 30% of it is crown, the tree is starting to slow down, and that would be a good time to thin.
What year post planting would you recommend considering VDT?
Well, VDT would be at PCTH, so at 15, but it's really to address a couple other issues. Like maybe your species distribution isn't what you want, so that's why you would create some openings, or you in your ownership don't have enough young forest. And that's kind of the reason why I've used it a lot in the commercial setting here, is because we have no young forest under 10 years old. It's like a missing forest type because there hasn't been any activity for 10 years. So that would be a consideration. And then another reason, like in riparian planting, is like you might want to leave the strip along the river dense and not thin it. Because shade is your main objective.
Okay, somebody has a type F W/P buffer farm. What buffer do you use for conversion with the farmer? He won't want 150 feet.
Well, kind of depends on the species composition. There, you might be able to get away with a hardwood conversion, or there's like special plans depending on the ownership. So again, I would reach out to forest practice forester in your area.
Does the tribe have objectives for understory diversity and density in their maintained riparian forests? Do other entities, like DNR, for example?
We don't have any specific like diversity indexes for understory. And I'm not sure that DNR does, but I guess I've worked in the private sector where we had a habitat conservation plan for the area we were operating. And we weren't meeting the understory component of that. So we employed at PCTH creating openings a little under an acre in hopes that we would, because it was like 90% of the farm was Douglas fir plantation. And it turns out at 30, there's not a whole bunch of understory when you're managing that way. So part of the plan required this much coverage of huckleberry and other things. So that's why we employ the variable density thinning in that scenario. But yeah, it does depend on the organization you're working for. If they have a specific metric you need to meet, variable density thinning, I think in the understory gives you the opportunity to amend or enhance that understory component.
Let's see, yeah, and Jonathan Worley was asking that he has some sites with about 20-year-old dense spruce monocultures that are shrubby with no understory. Probably due to tip weevil. If we thin in those areas, would you expect the remaining trees to gain height, or will they remain shrubby and just open up light for weeds and adjacent unplanted areas to creep in? How would you balance the downsides of each management option? Leave as is versus thin?
I think the downside, you're right, like you're gonna open it up for invasive species and whatnot. I think you need to look at that site and say, I think we need more resources. I think this would be a great time to amend the species composition and create some openings. Thinning, tip weevil's a thing, no doubt. But thinning is going to give that tree more resources to keep fighting. And it might just have to keep doing this like regrowing tops and have some ugly form. But if you're trying to reach a shade objective, I would still thin, and then I would create openings and amend the species with something else, maybe some western white pine, maybe some Douglas fir.
Then we have a question. Have you found scenarios where thinned trees could be used in other restoration projects? For example, small or large woody debris installations?
Yeah. I mean, anytime you're extracting, you can sell those logs to whoever you want. It could be for in-stream projects, but that again would be the scenario. Is this site available for commercial harvest? I'm not sure. You might be able to work a deal where you deliver them directly to the adjacent stream if you're trying to work that, but that would be a question for the forest practice forester. If it is slated for commercial harvest, you're outside of that core zone. Yeah, those trees could provide structure for any of the habitat restoration projects.
We have a question about retention of on-site biomass. In general, and if budget allows, would it be preferable to cut and drop trees in place during a thinning rather than extract trees?
Yeah, I think there's kind of these targets for down woody debris, or it can be an indice of like, oh, is this actually an old growth forest that should have this component of downwoody debris. But if you don't need any of the money or the lumber from a commercial harvest, then certainly you could leave it on the ground. It's up to you. And then like with a pre-commercial thinning, it's because there is no market for those trees. And a lot of times extraction, like if it's a steep site and it's going to require cable logging setup for commercial, the cost of logging may outweigh the actual what you could get for the lumber. So that's why a lot of those projects don't happen. If you want to go through and just cut trees down to alleviate resource stress and leave them there, it's completely up to the owner.